Hello and welcome back to our video series. In this video, we're going to continue writing tests for our React application. I also got my refill for my apple juice, so let's jump right into it. We were testing some of the simpler components. Now, the first test that we want to tackle is basically testing whether or not the navigation items change its styling depending on the current path. Right? But in our notes, it says test nav item. Well, again, the thought process or the kind of thought exercise is what should nav bar be concerned with, right? Should the component nav bar be concerned with how its children, nav items specifically, navigation items specifically, should it know how the navigation items change in its styling depending on the current path? You can argue one way or another. I would argue that probably not, right? And that gives me a hint that, well, maybe it's time for us to, again, extract it away. Extract the components for navigation items in its own component, right? So that's what I'm going to do, say nav item.js. Right, and let's see what I need from here. Nav item is a styled link, which is a link, so I will need that. I probably won't need React Router, so let's do this. I will remove that. I'm going to say export default function nav item, and it returns something. What does it return? It returns something that looks like that, right? And we're going to have it so that this is coming from children. Now we could do it differently. We could do something like label and do it that way. I'm going to go with children. And it should have two. It should also have a path name, I believe. So yeah, that's that. We do need style link itself. So, oh, right. So we're gonna grab a hold of that, paste it down there. So all of that looks pretty good. Save it. Down here, we're going to say nav item. Can I import it? There you go. And the way that it works is like so. I need to pass in path name, which is location.pathname, and 2, which is that. So ultimately, it's pretty much the same. So I can just simply do that, right? Why is it complaining? Oh, there you go. So once we have done that, I actually don't need this anymore, which means I also don't need this anymore. Yeah, looking good. Doing that didn't break our test, which is a good sign. And now let's write some tests for our nav items. Let's go over here, copy this. Oh no, that's the navigation item itself. Ooh, as you can see, it's pretty long. We're gonna go one by one, okay? So right here, let's comment out the rest and start with the first one. Again, we're using mount. I'll pass. Let's go for the first test. It renders children. So we're basically saying, because we are making it so that we can pass in the children inside here, so we can do something like that, right? We're basically testing whether or not that works as intended. So Again, we need to wrap it up with router because nav item is using link, and link cannot function without it being wrapped inside a router component. Cool. So we've already seen how to test rendering of children props. So we're doing the same thing. We're mounting our components with a children prop being passed in, and we're just saying, okay, wrapper.contains the same exact thing to be truthy. Makes sense. The next thing that we want to test is the no border bottom. So the next thing that we're going to test is this part right here. So the dynamic styling that is being applied, right? So no border bottom when props to and current path are different. There should be no border bottom when the two props to and current path are different. Oh, I think when I was writing this, I was doing it a little differently. We can just change this to path name. Okay, so that's that. So when these guys have different values, it should not render any border bottom. So we're doing that, but then how do we get the actual styles that are being applied? Well, that's a tiny bit tedious, at least in my experience. If you know like a much easier way to get the calculated and applied styles, please let me know. This is the way that I've done it. So first to find the nav item itself. So we need to actually give an ID as well. What do we call it? Nav item. So find it, grab a hold of that, and then at 0, get the DOM node, right? And then you run get computed style, and then you can get the property value border bottom. That should give you the value. And that should be an empty string because we're doing it as none, but it won't actually appear as none because get property value. So basically this has to do with how style components work. If there's none, so if you provide a value that is like that doesn't do anything, like border bottom none, it actually won't apply that style like at all, right? So what we end up getting is an empty string. So save that, and it should pass. There we go. But let's test the more interesting thing, which is when it is the same, there should be a border bottom. So again, we just have to change this a little tiny bit, like so. We do that. Now, same exact code up until here, but now that these are the same, the styles that are being applied should include a border bottom that looks like this, right? So we save that, and voila, there we go. Cool. Before I forget, let's change our notes here as well. Where are we? There we go. There we go. Okay, cool. So we've tested our navigation items and our nav bar. All is well. Our final component to test is users. Now it's a lot more complex because users is actually rendering data that we got from fetching, right? That we got from sending a GraphQL request. How should we test that? Now to test that, there's actually a really good documentation coming from Apollo itself about how to test React components when you're using Apollo client. And pretty much we're going to do the same exact thing that's laid out here. So let's go over here. Let's take a look at what we're going to do. Grab a hold of all of that, copy to clipboard, create a file, users.test.js, paste it. Again, let's just do it one by one. Oops, All right, let's save that, and it should pass. Oh, it's not passing. Okay, I actually found the mistake, guys. Basically, get users query. That's what I was trying to import, but I had it named as get users without underscore query, and basically it was exporting, or it was importing from here undefined, as opposed to importing this because, well, it is undefined. But as soon as I actually change this to get users query, save that, save this, now it all passes. Right, so it was a stupid mistake, but I found it. So let's take a look at the actual test here. We're basically testing whether it renders a page title. So it goes through this whole thing that I mentioned, and the users.js should have an h1 with the text users inside of it, and that's what we're testing for, and it works. A quick recap about what's happening over here. We're trying to test a component that has a Polo client in it, right? We're using the component query, I believe, right? So normally in your actual application, what happens is when you use this component and you send off a query, it'll look for out of its parents, it'll look for a component, Apollo provider, in which you can find right here in your app.js, right? So Apollo provider is what will be actually sending off the network request, the GraphQL request, right? But that's not what we want to do in our tests. We want to mock that whole network request and response. So we're using a mock provider instead, which basically takes in our mocked data in both request and response. So you have to write this out the way that you want it to work. So you do that, and then you render it, and then see whether or not it rendered correctly. Right. The next thing that we're going to test is it should render loading state initially. I think I need to edit a few things here. Another great thing about Apollo client, even for testing, is the fact that, remember I was talking about how Apollo client, when you use query, it provides you with things like loading, error, and data. So it's very easy to implement kind of like loading UI and stuff like that. So even in mocked situations and when you're testing, the same applies. Right, so this whole part here will still work. But if you think about it, well, the thing is, we're not actually sending a request. We're not actually sending a network request, so there's no latency, right? However, mocked provider still goes through that process. It won't actually take a lot of time. In fact, it's a split-second difference, but it will initially render its children with loading being true and data being undefined, right? And after a split second, like after a split millisecond, it will re-render with loading being false and data being populated. So it actually mocks that behavior inside your tests as well. So we can use that and see if it behaves correctly, right? So if we grab a hold of that, paste it right here, let's read through it. We expect wrappers HTML string to contain email@email.com. That is coming from the mock data right here as from the response, which should be rendered through this bit here in users.js. So it should work, right? But it's going to fail. And the reason why it fails is, again, because mock provider basically emulates that whole process of there being a network request in flight without a response being given yet, and hence loading being true and data being undefined. It will actually go through that whole process, right? So when you test it right away, as soon as you render it, mount it, and then you test, okay, the HTML string should contain some information that is coming from the response, it will not work, or it'll fail. But it's expected. This is the behavior that you want. We just have to write a different test. What we have to write is, instead of the content that is coming from the network response, when loading is true, we're saying that we render this, right? So instead, what we will do is say it'll contain loading, right? So let's comment that out for a second and then take a look here. Now it should pass, right? Because again, as soon as it's mounted, retested at that very moment, loading is true. So it'll render this, but data is undefined, so it will not render this. However, we can just make it so that we wait 0 milliseconds, again, like just a tiny bit, and then we try to run it again. And in that case, by the time when this line of code gets executed, loading will be false and data will be populated with the mock data that we provided with. So we save this and it should all pass. There we go. Fantastic. Yep, so this is how you would test your components that are using Apollo client components, right? Of course, there's a lot more that you can do, but these are some of the basic tests that you would write for pretty much every component that you write, all right? That was long. I am going to go ahead and grab another apple juice, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.